Recently, because of all of these mass shootings that have been going on, there's been a lot of talk about these red flag laws. So what I want to do in this video is go over these red flag laws, talk about what they are, how they work, and just basically give you an idea about them. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of emotions about these red flag laws that people on the right and on the left already have their opinions about it. But just try to be open-minded as you listen to this video before you actually decide where you land. So, the first thing we have to do is talk about what red flag laws are. So from the New York Times, we have that they are state laws that authorize courts to issue a special type of protection order, allowing the police to temporarily confiscate firearms from people who are deemed by a judge to be a danger to themselves or to others. I think it's important to recognize the temporarily part because that is sometimes missed. That when you are deemed a danger through a red flag law, if your guns are confiscated or if your ability to buy guns is retracted, that is a temporary status. It's not a permanent thing. So who can say that your gun should be removed? And generally it's from a family member or a friend, someone either you know well or who associates with you. It can also be a police officer. It depends a lot on the particulars of the case. But the basic idea is that if you show signs that someone views as being exceptionally aggressive towards others or toward yourselves and they believe you're a danger, that they have to provide evidence to a court, and that court, if the evidence is sufficient, will issue an order either taking the guns you already have or making it so you cannot buy guns from here on out. So one thing that's important to note about all of this is while that is going on, you are not informed about it. You don't know that you're currently being talked about, that there's a red flag law in place for you until either they come and take your guns or I guess they tell you you can't buy guns. So that I think is an important thing to note. Again, that part is temporary. After that happens, you can then go argue to a court or to a judge why you should have these rights reinstated. So if we're going to be talking about repealing the Second Amendment for someone or taking away their guns, we need to see if it's actually going to do anything, if it's going to be effective. So that begs the question, are these red flag laws effective? Do they even work? It's a yes, but also a no. You see, red flag laws have been shown to decrease the rate of suicide. And that just basically makes sense. If you see someone who is a danger to themselves, you can then, through these red flag laws, take away their guns if they have any, and it would decrease their likelihood of committing suicide. So I think we can all agree that right there is a good thing. But at the same time, there isn't really any evidence to suggest or support that red flag laws will decrease mass shootings. So the reason we're talking about these red flag laws is because of the mass shootings we've had recently, and red flag laws are one of the proposed solutions. At least currently, there is not enough evidence to suggest that red flag laws would actually decrease the number or the rate of these mass shootings. So if the goal of these laws is to decrease mass shootings, it doesn't really look like it's going to do anything. Now, red flag laws on the left are generally viewed in a positive way because it's some form of gun control and they think that it would be beneficial. On the right, there's actually a pretty big divide between those who support it and those who don't, even among people who have guns or support the Second Amendment. For instance, we have here an op-ed from USA Today, and the title is "The Red Laws Are Kafkaesque and They Strip Gun Owners of Their Constitutional Rights." And he continues by saying that it will let police confiscate guns without due process. So obviously not a fan of red flag laws. On the other hand, you've had prominent individuals such as President Trump who has actually come out in support of some variation of a red flag law. He said, quote, "We must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and if they do, those firearms can be taken away through rapid due process. This is why I have called for red flag laws." So here Trump is explicitly saying that we need some form of red flag law. And there's also been talk about the TAPS Act that I know Congressman Dan Crenshaw is talking about. So there are some on the right who, at least in some form, will support a red flag law. Now, before I explain how I feel about this, if you appreciate getting content like this, getting informed and getting all the sources I provide down below, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, leave a like, a comment, just basically let YouTube know you appreciate the content that I'm providing. So to look at how this might work, what I actually want to do first is look at what happened in the most recent mass shooting. So I'm not going to share the name or a picture of the mass shooter, but this happened in Odessa, Texas. But a month before this shooting even happened, his neighbor called and said that he had threatened her at gunpoint for leaving trash on his property. So this seems like a fairly clear red flag now that we have the benefit of hindsight. But in that instance, it wouldn't have been so clear. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that she called the cops because she was threatened with a gun, as she should have done, and the cops never even showed up. Now, the reason they gave is because I guess their houses were kind of far in the country and there was no GPS available. You couldn't get there through GPS. But it just seems kind of ridiculous to me that the cops did not investigate this further when someone calls and says they were threatened by gunpoint. So that seems like a fairly large failure on part of the police. But aside from that, knowing what we know now, when he actually did in fact shoot people, that's a red flag. But if we were back a month before and this hadn't happened, could you look at that and actually say that that was enough of a red flag to take away his guns? The claim of one individual, is that enough to suspend his due process and his Second Amendment right? Again, we can now see that maybe it would have been a good thing in this instance, but we had no way of knowing that this would happen. So that brings up to me the biggest issue that I have with these red flag laws. And that is basically, how much evidence do you need before you can take away someone's guns and their Second Amendment right? On the one hand, if you make it too strict of a law that what we just saw, an accusation by one individual is more than enough to get your guns taken away, that's a pretty big deal. Because if you have someone who you upset and then to get back at you, they just want to lie and make something up, say that you did or said something you didn't do, and then the police come and take your guns, there is no due process there, and that is not acceptable. And before you say that no one would do that, there are a fair amount of documented false rape accusations. In some instances, got people kicked out of college. So people do and say stupid things to get back at people they don't like. So I think it's entirely possible there could be a fair amount of false claims. On the other hand, if the laws are too lenient and they don't really apply to anybody unless there's a mountain of evidence, then the law is kind of pointless. So the real problem is, where do these red flag laws apply? Again, is an accusation by one individual without any other documentation, is that enough to take away someone's Second Amendment rights? I don't think so. And if that is what is entailed in these red flag laws, then in no way would I support them. The question is, where do they actually land? And so I think before I could say whether or not I agree with one, I'd actually have to look up and see if it's clear on what amount of evidence is required to then take away someone's Second Amendment rights. And I think that's really important. Before you say you support or don't support a red flag law, at least look at how that is specified. I do want to talk about one negative aspect of a red flag law that has actually already happened. Now, this story is from last year, but I think it still applies. Now, there was an individual in Maryland who, again, he wasn't informed, but there was a court order to go and take away his guns because some red flag law had applied to him. And so the cops show up at 5 o'clock in the morning to take away his guns, and he gets a little bit irritated, some fighting ensues, and he eventually gets shot and he dies. So first off, 5 o'clock in the morning, is that really when you're going to knock on people's doors to take away their guns? Now, the other problem that I have with this instance is that, as far as I'm aware, we have not been informed on why the red flag issue was ordered whatsoever. We have no idea what this individual did to warrant them coming at 5 o'clock in the morning to take away his guns. And that's a big problem for me. Because if you're going to take away someone's Second Amendment rights, you have to be explicit and you have to be clear on why you're doing it. And that is not happening in this case. So that's another big issue that I have with these red flag laws, is if you cannot show or will not show why someone's guns are being taken away from them, that's a really big problem. If these red flag laws are to be considered whatsoever, everything has to be crystal clear. You cannot just take people's word for it that it was justified. I'd need to see why they thought it was justified. That's a pretty big deal. So now I want to hear from you. Do you support any variation of red flag laws? If you don't support red flag laws, is it because you're afraid that it would be over broadly applied to basically anyone with a gun? And regardless of where you stand, I think everyone can agree that at some point it would be okay for your guns to be removed. But what would be that point? If you don't support red flag laws, do you think they have to actually have committed a crime for that to happen? And if you do support red flag laws, where is your line? Do you think an accusation by one individual is enough? Does there need to be some real hard evidence they can provide to a court? Let me know down below, and be sure to check out one of these other videos that you may have missed up here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.